Deep Thoughts.
Wow, that's pretty deep.
Deep?
Hey, this is Deep Thoughts, a podcast exploring the Christian faith a little more deeply, and I'm your host, Matt Shantz. Today in the West, many consider the church to be dead or dying. Christianity is seen as outdated, bigoted, and responsible for many of society's problems. What this does is it leaves many believers embarrassed about their faith and many outsiders wary of Christians and their movement. But what if the Christian message is not the enemy of our modern Western values, but actually the very thing that makes sense of them? My guest is Glen Scrivener. He's a speaker and filmmaker, director of the charity Speak Life, and the author of multiple books, including this one, entitled The Air We Breathe: How We All Came to Believe in Freedom, Kindness, Progress, and Equality. Now, those very nouns I just stated are actually distinctively Christian ideas. And so Christianity didn't just kind of turn the ancient world upside down, but actually continues to underpin the way our society thinks about life, worth, and meaning today. In other words, Christianity has impacted our culture so profoundly that we don't notice it's in the very air we breathe. And so now, here's my deep conversation with Glen Scrivener. Well, hey, Glen, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Matt.
So I did a little bit of research about you, and there's a Wikipedia page about Glen Scrivener, who played for the Canadian Football League and won the Grey Cup in 1994 with the BC Lions, which is our home team. So it's great to have you on.
Go Bombers.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. There you go. You've heard of the Canadian Football League?
Oh yeah, he must be so annoyed that his Google ganger is this like foppish guy with a fringe, and he's built like a fridge, isn't he? That guy.
I mean,
Yeah.
I assume so. He was like listed as like, what is he? He's a defensive tackle. Yeah. So he'd be a big boy. Yeah.
He is a very big boy. So yeah, when people Google me, sometimes they discover like the Canadian footballer Glen Scrivener, and then they're very disappointed to meet me. Can you imagine?
Well, just for the sake of our listeners getting to know this Glen Scrivener a bit better, how did an Australian wind up in England? And I'm sure it wasn't for the weather. And then what do you get up to with this charity you run called Speak Life?
The love of a good woman keeps me in Eastbourne on the south coast of England. She's from Belfast in Ireland, in Northern Ireland. So my wife thinks that Eastbourne is halfway, and I let her think that, and that is the secret to a good marriage. So we met at university over here in England. And yes, I've been back and forwards between Australia and here. I've now lived more than half my life in the UK, and we are based here on the south coast of England. Speak Life is an evangelistic ministry that I help with. It was already a ministry called by a different name, and then my boss retired, and we kind of rebranded. But it's been going for 70 years, and it's basically about equipping the church to reach the world. And our little strapline is love Jesus, share Jesus. We want to evangelize the church so that the church can evangelize the world.
Oh, that's amazing. And I loved the book you wrote called The Air We Breathe. And I'd love for you to just explain the premise to us. I had Andrew Wilson on a few months back about his book that said all kinds of things about the year 1776. And the two of you have done a podcast together called Post-Christianity. Just interested to hear, there's a kind of a fascinating niche and maybe some overlap between the two of you in those books. But what is this book about?
So the air we breathe, we never notice, and it's invisible to us. And most of the time, it's an unacknowledged reality in our lives that we depend on for everything. And I think our moral intuitions are a bit like that. I think we navigate the world via certain moral beliefs about compassion and equality and freedom and progress. And I go into 7 of them in the book. And what you notice when you actually pay attention to your breathing, when you actually pay attention to the air that invisibly surrounds you and that supports you, but that you don't usually investigate. What you notice is that things like compassion and equality and progress and freedom are not the sorts of things that are obvious or natural or universal or self-evident. They're not actually the result of doing a whole bunch of scientific experiments. They very much are in the realm of belief. And yet, whether you've been inside a church or you've never set foot inside a church, you continually navigate your life by these beliefs. And I kind of in the book do a little historical kind of journey from Genesis to George Floyd and kind of take you from Old Testament to New Testament to early church to the Middle Ages to the scientific revolution to the abolition of the slave trade through the 20th century and into the modern day. And I want to show how all these values that we navigate our lives by are not natural, not obvious, not universal. They are the result of specifically Christian biblical theology that has worked its way out of the church and into the culture. And what I want to do is hopefully awaken people from outside the church to the fact that A, they are a believer already, and B, a lot of the things they already believe are particularly Christian-ish. And if you keep on pulling at those threads, I pray and hope that people find Jesus Christ at the other end.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, along those lines, Glenn, like you and I aren't American, but we're familiar with the famous line in the Declaration of Independence that states, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." But you push back on that idea that they're self-evident, unalienable rights, but particularly Christian, actually, right? Can you explain that?
Yeah, I'm sure you've got into with Andrew Wilson the fact that Thomas Jefferson actually wrote that these rights are sacred and undeniable.
Mm-hmm.
And in a round of edits before the publication on July 4th of 1776, Benjamin Franklin put a little red line through sacred and undeniable and just wrote self-evident above that. And that edit really does encapsulate our shift from Christian to post-Christian sensibilities. Even for Thomas Jefferson, who was not an Orthodox Christian by any stretch of the imagination, and was a Unitarian and wanted to see the dying out of the Christian church actually within and predicted it within his lifetime. He nevertheless said, well, obviously our concept of rights has come from the Bible. It's come from our belief that we are made in God's image. And so it's a sacred truth. It's a revealed truth. Benjamin Franklin wants to found the republic on something that is less contested than religion.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, let's bring it from revelation down into the realm of reason. And isn't it reasonable to simply grant everybody human rights and to see that everybody has an inviolable, unalienable, or we might in modern times say inalienable kind of right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But of course, the problem is, the only thing that's self-evident about such rights is that they are not self-evident.
That's right.
And if they were, you would discover them around the world and down through history. They would be a human universal, and they're absolutely not a human universal. People have not looked at every member of the human family and granted to them a moral equality before the law or in the eyes of God. That's not the way ancient societies have rolled. Ancient societies have woven into them the idea of inequality, of hierarchy, know your place. And, when you look at the Hammurabi Code from Babylon, sort of 1800 BC, that sort of time period, people are amazed that there's this ethical system. And of course, isn't it wonderful that people in ancient times had an ethical system? We've got an ethical system too. That goes to show you don't need Christianity. But if you look into those 282 rules, I think, in the laws in the Hammurabi Code, it's very segregated. If you're the king, then the law is this. If you're a slave, the law is that. If you're a citizen, the law is this. If you're an outsider, the law is that. Absolutely woven into ancient thinking has always been this idea of steep hierarchy, and therefore justice for an ancient person has always been the enforcement of inequality, not the bringing about of an equalization, which is what we tend to think of as justice.
Yeah.
And where do we get this idea that every human being equally has the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I think T.S. Eliot said in the beginning of the 1900s, he said, if you remove from the word human everything that the Bible has given to us, what you are left with are some very clever, adaptable, mischievous apes. To view the human person as somebody as a person who possesses inalienable human rights is to be standing on a pile of Bibles, is to be
Uh,
looking through a particularly scriptural lens to view the human
yeah.
in that way. Take away those scriptural lenses, and what you don't see are self-evident human rights. What you see are mischievous, clever, adaptable apes.
Mhm.
So why do we have these inviolable human rights? I think historians like Tom Holland would tell you this has come from the Bible. It has not come from self-evident reason.
And that would be such news to people today who really do just sort of take it as, well, like, yep, yeah, obviously, of course, but not recognizing that in history and even in some other cultures today, what we're talking, that the distinction is stark, right? That we would expect equality among, in terms of the value of somebody across gender and classes and um, ethnicities, like we essentially, like you say, it's in the air we breathe. We take it for granted, but you're stating that's distinctly Christian. That's news to a lot of people today, isn't it?
Yeah. But it doesn't take a lot to point it out to people. In the same way that you didn't notice your breathing until I started talking about noticing your breathing, and
Yeah,
then
no.
all of a sudden you do start.
Yeah.
Like, oh,
No,
I'm
no.
forgetting. Oh, it's so hard.
Yeah.
But but when you do start pointing out these sorts of things, I think people very readily accept, oh yes, I guess it's true. And
Mhm.
and where you really see how much these things are an assumption is where they are violated. So if you violate the first of the seven values that I talk about in terms of equality, if you violate the fact that every member of the human family is the moral equal of every other member of the human family, no matter how rich you are, how poor you are, how strong you are, how weak you are, male, female, gay, straight, black, white, we're all one, we're all equal, right? If you violate that, you get kicked off Facebook within minutes.
Right.
Within minutes,
Mhm.
right? And we recognize it for the blasphemy that
Yeah.
it is, right? It's a sacrilegious kind of a thing. And something like a religious sentiment rises up, even in the most secular person at that stage. And at that point, you kind of recognize, oh, we've been navigating the world not via reason and evidence, actually, but by these moral intuitions that have a very faith-based kind of substance to them.
Yeah. It's an encouragement. Like you write in the introduction of the book that you're writing it for the nuns, the duns, and the ones, like that this is meant to be accessible to everybody. And what I found so refreshing is it for the ones, in terms of like, yes, I believe in the Christian movement. I'm a follower of Jesus. Um, it really is encouraging. It's comforting to be like, yeah, like this. Because sometimes we get the sense from society like Christianity's bad news. It's not a
Mm.
good contribution. You guys are backwards. You're outdated, maybe even bigoted, and yet we have folks like Tom Holland or Richard Dawkins recently saying that he's a cultural Christian. I don't want to misquote him, but essentially saying
Mm.
it's this guy who very much has been sort of pushing against Christianity and religion is now
Right.
saying, well, like essentially, I'm glad that it's here. I get to live in the
Yeah.
benefit of what it's contributed. I appreciate that honest
Yeah, yeah.
look
It's a
in at society,
fundamentally decent religion, he said. Yeah,
which
yeah,
is
which is not exactly the tune he was singing in the God
it's a,
Delusion.
a
But
bit of
yeah,
a turnabout, right? Yeah, yeah. But I appreciate the intellectual honesty to say there are inherent goods about Christianity, whether you give assent to the whole thing or not. It's intellectually honest to say, I'm glad it contributed this thing and that it's in the very air we breathe. One of the pieces that
yeah,
I found
yeah.
fascinating, you did two back-to-back chapters, one on enlightenment, one on science, and I don't want to conflate the two, but there is a kind of a common thread here about like the intellect and engaging of the mind, and I mean, you even push back on this idea that the Dark Ages were really that dark or at least they were bringing things
Yeah.
along in society. How has Christianity itself contributed to the intellect, the value of thinking well, the mind as it pertains to enlightenment and science?
Mm.
Small
Well,
question.
it was
Yeah.
a very deliberate decision. Yeah, sure. It's just a 1,000 year period to discuss. Um, but yeah, it was a very deliberate decision of mine to call a chapter about the medieval period Enlightenment,
Yeah.
because uh, certain historians used to call that period the Dark Ages, and still people talk about the Dark Ages, or even just the use of the word medieval. It's often nowadays like a synonym for something that is backward or broken, just rubbish, And I even
Yeah.
found myself using it the other day. I said, my Wi-Fi is positively medieval at this point. Like, and what do we mean at that stage? Because of course it's incredibly anachronistic to talk about Wi-Fi that's medieval. But that sentence only makes sense if you assume that medieval means broken, backwards, bigoted. It's just full of battles and boils and bubonic plague. That's
Yeah.
the medieval period, and yet it's the period of time in which cathedral schools began to be established, real kinds of honoring of ancient wisdom in sort of Greco-Roman culture was really, like brought to the fore. Um, you had liberal arts education being kind of established in this time that led to like universities. Like here, universities are a product of medieval Christendom.
Hmm.
Um, and you had, the canon lawyers kind of establishing a language around rights that remains with us to this day. I mean, the Declaration of Independence is unthinkable without the medieval period and without um, this use of the language around humans having rights, and there's an incredible intellectual tradition behind that. You've got figures like Augustine, like Anselm. You've got
Hmm.
figures like Aquinas. These are just towering intellects. Alongside them, you've got artists like Chaucer or like Dante. You've got the invention of parliaments going on in medieval times, and so much of what we now credit the Enlightenment with was first kind of discussed and hammered out in medieval times. And so like you've got the some of the greatest intellectual, history that humankind has ever known happening in a period that we think of as the Dark Ages.
Hmm.
And at that point, you kind of recognize that something's been going on with our telling of history. That we now consider ourselves to be the enlightened ones that came after the Dark Ages.
Right.
And I kind of talk in the book about how, well, first of all, there was a spiritual movement called the Reformation, which absolutely, there were sort of rediscoveries of, gospel truths that I think were life-giving for the church. But when you cast everything that's gone before you as darkness, and now we're moving into the light, um, I think you secularize that, and all of a sudden, Enlightenment philosophers from the sort of the 17th, 18th century, they start to do the same thing, not just about theology. They start to do the same thing about all of history. Like everything that's come
Hmm.
before us has been dark, and we
Yeah.
are the bright ones. We are the ones that we've been waiting for. And you still get that sense nowadays, which is why when call your Wi-Fi medieval, um, you're making a theological claim. You're making a claim about history that
Yeah.
that somehow history is progressing always, and what's come before us is probably problematic and probably needs to be reformed. And we are moving our ways towards the sunny uplands of, the land of milk and honey. All of that is again testimony to the fact that we navigate the world via these moral intuitions and these gut instincts. And what do you notice about the darkness into light story, or the desert into, promised land kind of story? It's a profoundly Christian-ish story that we're telling, even if we're telling it against the church.
I mean, yeah, I found that to be, I mean, quote unquote really enlightening because I was like, oh yeah, that's so true. I knew these things, but revisionist history is so interesting, right? We just put this canvas on it, like oh, the Dark Ages, nothing happened, and yet, like you said, it was very much full of bringing culture to the point that it is today. It was very much a movement that way. I would argue there's probably, maybe you can push back, but I'd be hard pressed to say there's not an issue today where Christians are perceived to be more out of step, or at best, more out of step at best, and hateful and bigoted and on the wrong side of history at worst, than in regards to sexuality. But there are at least a couple contributions of the Christian sexual ethic that Western society today deem as self-evident truths that were not. The first being the idea of consent, and another in regards to children. We take those as self-evident, like you go to jail if you're inappropriate with a minor.
Right.
Right. And this idea of consent, or look at the Me Too movement, how power dynamics were used, and used as society would deem improperly. You trace those back to essentially the Christian sexual ethic, a movement of Christianity, again, that's given society these things that we say, well, of course, and yet aren't of course, except for Christianity.
Yeah. I think the sexual ethic of 2024 is the product of two different sexual revolutions. When we talk about the sexual revolution, we're probably thinking about the 1960s and everything that's, contraception kind of delivered to us in terms of, here is a technology in which women can disable a function within themselves. And what you've got is at that point, the possibility of the equalization of the sexes, because now a woman can be as liberated in her sexual expression as men have always been able to be, because a man is not biologically tied to his offspring. He's not biologically tied to his mate. He's not biologically tied to his offspring. That's why we have marriage and family, right? Is because we have these strong social bonds that actually, tie a man to his wife, tie a man to his children. The woman is biologically kind of connected to her offspring, and through contraception and through widespread abortion as well, there is this sort of the cutting of the bonds between sex and children, between sex and pregnancy, and between pregnancy and children. Contraception and abortion kind of cut those two bonds between sex and pregnancy, pregnancy and children. Yeah. To the point where we can now live a little bit more like atomized individuals out there in the world. And that is sort of one of the sexual revolutions that has happened, and there's widespread consequences to that. But 1900 years before the swinging 60s, there was a different sexual revolution. And that was Jesus coming into the middle of history and saying to an incredibly patriarchal society in which child sexual abuse was not only tolerated but celebrated. Pederasty was your sort of initiation into the ways of sort of adult sexuality, and an older man was usually inducting a younger boy into the ways of sexuality, and it was called pederasty, which is the Greek for child love. And Christians were like, no, that's child abuse, and they called it as such. And as soon as they had legislative influence, they kind of outlawed that. And Jesus in Matthew 19 comes along and he says, according to the Christian sexual ethic, marriage is one man, one woman for life. The doors are locked. No one gets out of this thing alive, right?
Yeah.
And whereas the 1960s sexual revolution kind of basically said, well, women can be as liberated as men have always been allowed to be. Actually, the first sexual revolution was the other way around, right? Men traditionally and around history and around the world, men have always been able to get away with more in the sexual realm, culturally and biologically. And what does Jesus do? Jesus says, oh, no, men must be as restricted as women have always been expected to be, right? That was Jesus' sexual revolution. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the genius move. That is the men are now to tame their sexuality and to be connected to their wives and to their children in covenant bonds. And And it is that marriage and family program, which is what evolutionary biologist Joseph Henrich calls it, that marriage and family program has birthed the modern world.
Yes.
And so much of not only our sexual ethic, but so much of Western prosperity has actually come from precisely that. Now, what it means is you kind of it is to de-emphasize eros and the erotic,
Mm-hmm.
and to completely play up agape, this other Greek word for love that's like self-giving love.
Mm.
And in a sense, in the words of historian Kyle Harper, you cramp all the world's libido into one frail sacred union called marriage, right?
Uh,
And the Christian ethic is that. I think it's a beautiful ethic. I think you can read Joseph Henrich, who's not a Christian, but in The Weirdest People in the World, he has this like 600-page book that shows you how this has absolutely been for the flourishing of society.
mm.
But you've got that revolution, and you've got the sexual revolution going on, which is kind of like Eros is, taken, the stopper is out of the bottle, and the genie of Eros is out again, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And what you get with the Me Too movement is a questioning of the 1960s sexual revolution, right? And they're like, oh, hang on. Eros running rampant is really scary. And so there's that questioning of the 1960s sexual revolution that is happening. And I would say that the grounds by which you can judge that sexual revolution and question whether it is for the flourishing of women or whether it is for the flourishing of society is to actually return to the first sexual revolution. And I think when people do that, they might just discover, as a refugee from the second sexual revolution, that there is a refuge in that first sexual revolution.
Oh, that's brilliant. And this it's a much more compelling kind of springboard to say perhaps the rest of the Christian sexual ethic is good and useful and actually leads to flourishing, as opposed to being looked at in light of the second sexual revolution and be like, man, that is so backwards. It's so dated, or it excludes some people, or it's critical and judgmental of different types of love. I think that's actually a really compelling springboard starting place, because in our moment now, I feel like the continuation is happening of people who aren't Christians coming to a realization in a number of different ways that they wouldn't frame it this way, but that actually the Christian sexual ethic, this idea of one man, one woman for life in covenant marriage, is the best way. So we've got young men wanting to quit porn, not for spiritual reasons, but because it's wrecking them like mentally and physically,
Right.
and
Right.
saying it's
Right.
not a good. And
No.
what they're choosing in that moment is essentially a step towards God's inherent vision, design, and what leads to flourishing. Was there anything else you'd say there about the Christian sexual ethic and in our moment? It's so contentious, and I feel like Christians are
Yeah.
often seen as sort of backwards, bigoted, that whole thing.
Yeah.
How do we propel
Yeah.
this stuff forward?
You just got to ask which of those revolutions is the regressive one? Like,
Mm,
um, Harvey Weinstein in first century Rome, what do you call him? You call him a senator. He's like, what did he do wrong according to an ancient culture? Harvey Weinstein in any other culture other than within this like very strict sexual ethic of the first century, is just business as usual. He is simply business as usual.
right.
And that's another area where we can just kind of point to where some of these values are violated, and then you kind of finally figure out what it is that you believed all along. And what you believe all along is that power should be used to serve and not to dominate. Well, where do you get that idea from?
Right.
Or you get the idea that bodies are much more like temples than they are like playgrounds. You're like, oh yeah. And the sexual revolution in the 1960s told us the opposite. It told us that bodies are like playgrounds, get over it, right? But when abuse happens, you recognize that when bodies are harmed sexually, it's not like you fall over in the playground and you bump your knee. When you're harmed sexually, that is like a violation. It's like a desecration. Bodies are more like temple. You're like, when these things are violated, you suddenly start to see what the original value really was. And power is to be used to serve. Bodies are more like temples than they are like playgrounds. Sex is a sacred thing, right? Which is why it's a desecration when it goes wrong. And you start to question whether the sexual revolution of the 1960s has been actually the regressive move. You know, I mentioned about abortion. Like if in the United States they're killing a million babies a year, globally we're killing a million babies a week, right, through abortion. And that sounds very ancient to me. That sounds very much like the the infanticide that was kind of happening in the first century, actually. So you've got in the first century, you've got men who kind of let their eros run rampant. And that's a very scary world. And you've got a world in which children become sexualized and children become disposable. And you ask the question, does the 1960s bring us forwards? Or did that sexual revolution actually take us backwards? So I would challenge the critique, like from the ground up. Is the Christian movement the regressive one, or isn't the rampant kind of tsunami of eros? Is that not the regressive mood? Is that not the regressive move that actually shrinks us as people and leads to less flourishing?
I mean, it's so fascinating. You do this over and over again in the book, and it's what I find so refreshing and it's so hopeful, Glenn, is we oftentimes, I think, in our moment feel like, oh, how do I like not just defend Christianity in sort of that strict apologetic sense, and but there's a real desire today to for people to pursue what appears to be beautiful and an inherent good. And so you're tapping into that so much that it's not just like, oh, I can kind of defend the Christian sexual ethic. I know it's a bit backwards or old school, but it's actually like, this is good. This is what leads to flourishing. But to do that across categories, I love how this book and your ministry, your voice sort of just help equip us in our moment that can sometimes feel a bit overwhelming. Like, how in the world do I tell a 21st century Westerner that Christianity is not only true, but that it's good, it's beautiful? And I know that that's a real heartbeat of yours in your ministry, that idea of evangelism and equipping Christians to evangelize. I'd love to just give you a last word here, some hope for Christians listening of just, hey, how can we speak into our moment with the light and love and beauty of Jesus Christ?
I think be glad that you're a Christian. Blaise Pascal talked about his way of explaining the faith back in the 1600s. 400 years ago, he said men despise religion and they fear that it might be true. And he talks about, like reassure people that it's not silly. But then he says, make people of goodwill wish it were true, then show them that it is.
Yeah.
And in a sense, I want to add even a step before that. Make Christians glad that it's true, then make non-Christians want it to be true, and then show them that it is. And in a sense, I hope the book does that for Christians as well. I hope they are glad for the Jesus Revolution and all that it has brought to the world. I did a talk recently on what has Christianity ever done for the world, right? What's it ever done for the world? And I just said, like, imagine that we were starting the Society for Human Progress, and we are interviewing different organizations to see whether they have a seat at the table in this Society for Human Progress. And I pointed to the person in the front row. What's your name? Jim. Okay, hi, Jim. Let's imagine that Jim, he is representing the organization that invented charity. And I say, what? You invented a charity, Jim? And Jim says, no, I didn't just invent a charity. I invented the very concept of charity. And in fact, my organization oversees countless charities around the world and down through history. And then I put it to the vote. Who thinks that the organization Jim represents deserves to be in the Society for Human Progress? All in favor say aye. And the room erupts with aye, right? And then I go to the next person, Jenny. Okay, Jenny, what organization do you represent? And she's She says, I represent the organization that outlawed child sexual abuse. Oh, fantastic. And you know where I'm going with this. I go to the next person, and this person outlawed the gladiatorial games. Blood sports were, the entertainment in Rome. And suddenly there's this one organization that kind of ended it. And hooray. And this person invented hospitals. This person invented hospices. This person invented the language around human rights. This person invented universities. This person invented, this person abolished the transatlantic slave trade, and around the room. And then, and of course, the punchline is Jim is representing the Church of Jesus Christ. Jenny is representing the Church of Jesus Christ. The Church of Jesus Christ. The Church of Jesus Christ. The Church of Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
Like, who can deny? Who can deny that the organization that has done most for human progress in society is the Church of Jesus Christ? And Christians, we just need to be a lot more glad that we're Christian.
That's a good word.
And then I think non-Christians will start to wish it were true and start discovering that it indeed is.
Wow. Brilliant. I love it. I'm so glad to be a Christian, and I'm so glad to have a brother in Christ like you, Glenn, who just this summer, as I read this book, it just warmed my heart, filled me with hope, was just really exciting to read. I've quoted you a couple times in sermons lately. It's just so thoughtful, all from a CFL legend, incredible, Glen Scrivener. Thanks for joining me for this conversation.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you, Matt.
Christianity is not only true, but it's good and it's beautiful. And that is a good word from Glenn there at the end, to encourage Christians to be glad and to be grateful that we're Christians, and hopefully feeling better equipped to tell others the good news. It's also an invitation to skeptics and those exploring Christianity to take an honest look at its contributions to the inherent goods of our society, and let that lead you to the founder and the perfecter of our faith, Jesus Christ. Hey, I want to thank you for listening to Deep Thoughts, and I hope it helps you in fostering deep faith. You are such a treasure, man. I hope you know that. I'm just a random.
Can I re-record my opening line? Because I think I said I don't think I even articulated the.
All right, let's do it.
Weird. Yeah.
Hey, Glenn, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me, Matt.
Amazing. Look at you.